Thanks everyone for joining today. We're really excited to have Jesse Korf here. Jesse is the Executive General Manager of Performance at Australia Cycling. He has previously done lots of work in pathways, both at Cycling Canada and Cycling Australia before he took on his current position. We had the opportunity to speak to Jesse about 10 days ago, and we posted that video on the Bridge the Gap website or the Bridge the Gap YouTube channel, which we'll be doing with this video after this discussion here today. Jesse, as we get warmed up for this conversation, we'll be asking the guests to ask you their questions directly. What were some of your main reflections on the first conversation we had that you want to drop into the room to get everybody primed for today's discussion?
Well, I don't know about priming because it probably gets down to individual questions of the coaches and people on the call, which I'm really looking forward to, because then we can tailor some responses if we have them available. But I think on reflection, we broadly touched on three themes. So one was around coaching and coach development. A second one was around skill development, both in racing, outside of racing, some longitudinal planning. And then we also had a bit of a system discussion around what's pathways versus ecosystems and what the role of different entities were. And I think we spoke predominantly about national sporting organizations or potentially PSOs as well, but maybe a little bit less around clubs and pro teams and development teams. So yeah, curious to see where today will bring us, which stream. But it was a fun conversation, like reflecting on them. And it's a little bit hard to read whether it's landed or whether some topics are more relevant or engaging than others, because that highly depends on the audience. And doing a bit of a Q&A and have some people in the room always makes it a bit more engaging and probably better in terms of providing some useful information, hopefully, and also allows for some questions to you to kind of clarify and sharpen things up to make sure that we understand the questions appropriately and see if we can help and provide a couple of answers. So yeah, keen for the chat today. Hopefully we can share some things that are helpful. Equally, it's great seeing a couple of familiar faces and a couple of new faces as well. So yeah, happy to get going, Kev.
Awesome. Well, we're really fortunate. There's lots of awesome guests on the call today. We're going to start with Peter Glassford. So Peter, could you just give us a very quick intro of who you are and how you fit into the sport, and then feel free to ask some of your questions.
Yeah, okay. Hopefully I'm okay. I'm in a coffee shop, so hopefully the noise isn't too bad. Yep, let me know if so. I've been coaching for about 25 years now. I'm really interested in like bike skills coaching, especially for the off-road disciplines, but obviously I've done the whole training peaks and that side of things in my life as well a lot. Work with a variety of athletes. We have a couple of younger athletes who are doing quite well out of our town in Collingwood, Ontario, going to Road Worlds and a couple of different higher end events. So that's really cool on the development side of things. I did submit multiple questions. I do like to submit questions, and I like that Kevin has put me on the spot here to start. I don't remember most of them, but the one that I do remember is a very big one, so we can take wherever we want. But I thought it in the name of systems, and I had a great conversation with Kevin earlier in the year, sort of around systems thinking and complexity, and it got really weird, but I guess that's what we're both into. With the Olympics coming in LA, without getting too political, there's a lot going on in the world, whether that's things burning down, philosophically or environmentally or whatever. I was curious how you're thinking and preparing athletes to get ready for that performance at the Olympics with all that noise going on outside of the system or outside of the boundary, or how you're setting boundaries, I guess we might say. So yeah, I'll give you that to run with as a small little opener, soft opener, and see where we go.
Starting small, eh? Geez. Okay. Right. So how do we help athletes prepare for the Olympics in a world that gets ever more noisy? I think where you'd start, Peter, and I'm probably not going to tell you anything that you don't know already, but it's getting increasingly more important to control the controllables and distraction control. There's this really awesome stream of research called Psychological Skills for Developing Excellence, which was done in the late 1980s and has been built on. And one of those key core skills there, it goes to planning, to visualization, et cetera. But one of them is distraction control. And getting back to, well, what are the things that we actually control? What are the primary elements of that we can create a bit of empowerment and ownership on with the athletes in general? But you got to think about where the athlete sits in their, maturity as well. I mean, if we're talking Olympics, you're probably not talking, well, unless it's BMX freestyle, maybe 15, 16, 17-year-olds. But even for elites, you get athletes that are, early into their elite journey, or maybe aren't as matured as others, and they tend to thrive a little bit more with an instructional style of coaching. So they'd like to be told what to do. The vast majority of athletes would probably sit in what you could call a bit of a co-exploration space, where the coach and the athletes co-explore a way forward. There's a bit of ownership. It's still the coach as the expert, but getting a lot more ownership, a lot more check and challenge, co-design with the athlete. That's probably the majority of your athletes. And then you get some athletes that are just, they hit mastery level, and no matter how knowledgeable you are as a coach, that athlete would know their sport and their body just from an intuitive perspective better than you could ever tell them to. And then it becomes more of like a mentorship soundboarding role. So pending the athlete, the whole notion around distraction control and ownership can shift a little bit across the paradigm. But I think the best thing that you could do is create that ownership, come back to controlling the controllables, actually keeping it relatively simple. And then as a coach or an organization around the athlete, rather than thinking about all of the things that you need to implement and do in order to maximize performance, sometimes it's beneficial, and in particular for something as big and complex as the Olympics, to at a certain point in time, and maybe that's 3 months in advance, maybe that's 6 months in advance, maybe that's 12 months in advance, do what is called in medical terms a via negativa approach, which basically speaks to what are all of the things that we can remove and stop doing without hurting the performance. And that can actually be, if you're looking at distraction control and mitigating against risk, something incredibly powerful. Because out of experience, the closer you get to the Olympics and the pressure gets on and the complexity gets on and the noise increases and you get sponsors and media and all of that, you just tend to try and want to do more and more and more, which, adversely makes things more and more complex and more noisy. So sometimes just looking at what are all the things that we can remove without breaking the performance, and kind of flipping the switch and taking that approach can be incredibly powerful. That's really around the athlete. It doesn't really speak to systems, but I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it's a big one. It's big and on a scale, but I think, whether it's the cancellation of races with weather or whatever, I think that big picture thing, very complex, is instructive maybe for something like our nationals. The gravel nationals had a heat issue with them, right? And you could see how athletes would get distracted. So yeah, I think that's really helpful. Now, Kevin, did you want me to sit on that then, or are you hoping I'm going through every question, or do you want to pass?
Well, you had a couple other really good ones. So feel free to follow up with.
Sorry, before we move on, can Leah answer the same question from an athlete perspective?
Oh, that one. Great question, Petrina.
Yes.
Okay, so repeat the question a little bit.
Yeah. So the idea was like, we're going to the Olympics, or how do you help the athletes going to the Olympics, given that there's so much going on outside of like our little neat cycling world? There's obviously like elements of like, will the Olympics get canceled, or like, will the place burn down, or whatever, right? So how do we prepare for peak performance, given that it's the biggest event possible?
Yeah. No, thanks, Petrina, for throwing it to me, because I think I lived this through COVID Olympics with Tokyo.
Good.
So, and I do agree with Jesse. It's like, I think so much, like, basically, my experience was I qualified for 2020 already at the end of 2019. And then, of course, we all lived through the uncertainty of the start of that year. And then, then they delayed the Olympics an entire year. So it was a whole other year of preparation. So yeah, and then even then we didn't know if they were going to happen. But I agree with Jesse. I think my approach really became like, what do I control as an athlete? Like, I don't know if they're going to happen, but I still have to train as if they are happening and arrive the best prepared possible. And yeah, it really was like coming back to the basics. And especially at the time, it's like, okay, what can I do to stay healthy? And how can I control my environment? So, we did things like we did an altitude camp before the Olympics, and we're very careful about controlling who was in our bubble there and what we were doing. It was stressful. I raced the Giro right before too. So again, you're also trying to like control variables in like an uncontrolled environment. So yeah, it's not easy to do, but like really adopting that mentality was helpful. And yeah, I was very grateful to work with a really good sport psychologist kind of through that time too. So I think having a good team around the athlete matters a lot. Like if you know you're going to go into really stressful situations. Yeah.
Leah, did you like, was there a point to what Jesse was saying about sort of like maybe like removing stuff? Like as you got closer, did you sort of say like to Jan or someone where it's like, if anything really important lets me know, but like I'm going to like go into monk mode or tunnel vision like in the last week or something like that, so you weren't seeing social media or anything like that?
Let's see. I know some athletes do that where, because it can be a big distraction, having phones and social media. And I never personally did that. Yeah, I feel like my lead-in was like I literally was at the Giro, so it wasn't really in monk mode. I was like in a stage racing mode. But no, I think just still doing the most, like it was mostly just focused on performance, staying healthy, ticking those kinds of boxes, and then just trying to like, yeah, accept that there's going to be things like I might get sick, like maybe the race doesn't happen. Like I just have to accept that if it happens. But yeah, good question though. But for some athletes, it would be helpful to go even more into their own little world.
Yeah, I think to build on Leah, Peter, as part of the question in what I meant, it may or may not removing things for the athlete themselves, because like Leah says, it's very individual. But I think as an organization or a team, the more you can risk mitigate and take away potential distractions or things that can derail it rather than amplify it, kind of helps the athlete execute and kind of keeps that environment that Leah was talking around as stable as humanly possible, knowing that it never will be stable and curveballs will happen. But the more you can mitigate, the better.
So thank you.
Great. So, Petrina, you had tons of great questions. I'm going to let you ask some questions to Jesse.
I really love this format. I'm going to start with that. Like where you guys have a conversation, we can really take time to absorb what was said. One of the questions I had you touched on was the technical skill, tactical side of the sport. And in Canada, especially in Alberta, where we're so spread out and we have athletes that train on their own and don't have access to clubs or club coaching or coaches that have knowledge of what the sport looks like in places like Europe. What are some, and I know that most of the people on this call are coaches or parents, but I'm going to throw this kind of to the athletes and maybe the coaches. What are some things that we as coaches can do and athletes can do to help gain those skills when we don't have access to the resources of the coaches that have that knowledge?
Yeah. Happy to start this off, and maybe Leah or Kevin want to build on this as well, because you can go pretty broad. And knowing that Leah grew up in Winnipeg and had to transition as well, there are probably some similarities there and some lessons learned from her story. But I think if you can split them up, last time we talked about cognitive perceptual skills, and that they're basically your tactical skills, is pattern recognition, situational awareness, and decision making, those kind of things. You can train all of those through a video, and there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that you can, and they do that really well in different sports, in particular sports like hockey and soccer. And what you can do is, and it's a little bit more challenging with top-down video, like you get, for example, if you watch a road race and they shoot from the helicopter, but you still can. But in particular, if you get footage from the motorbike, is showing that asking some really good exploratory questions or guided questions to athletes around what they're seeing, how people are positioned, how a bunch might evolve, what kind of different patterns they see when a breakaway starts to starts to move. When are athletes trying to move up and speed up before they get to a setup point, which is in effect the point before a feature like a critical turn or critical hill or narrowing of the road happens? And just asking a whole lot of questions. You can do a lot of that training through video. One of the most potent ways to actually do that is called occlusion training. And occlusion training effectively means you look at a video, you pause it or you black it out, and you go, right, what's going to happen next? And then have the athlete answer, and then look at what happened, and then going, okay, what did you see that prompted you to think A, B, or C would happen? And what actually happened, and why was it different? And then you can go back, well, were there other signals or cues that might be visible before that happening? And then you can just train that on and on and on and on. The most well-known form of occlusion training is probably for goalies, where they have somebody hit a puck or kick a ball, and then they freeze it without seeing the direction of travel of the puck, and actually have the goalies go, like, based on the movement of somebody kicking or hitting, where's the ball or the puck going? What does it mean? And then you can train that. So that's highly trainable. There's a lot of evidence behind it. You can do that remotely, easy, no problem. I think for the technical on the bike skills, you do need people at a certain stage, or cones and roads, and a bit of a critical mass. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need a bunch of 150, but to train bunch skills appropriately, you probably do need a group of 20, just to get those dynamics going, to really move through well, to learn how to be really tight in condition. So I think those tactical skills you can probably get away with. The technical on-bike skills, if you can't do that in your daily environment, then definitely find ways to do it in camps, because you have to do it with other people. I don't really know if there's another way around it.
I'd like to jump in here because we do actually have lots of coaches on the call. So kind of following up on that, I'm curious to know, of all the coaches on the call, when you do have an opportunity to get your athletes together to train in small camps or group environments, how often do you mix in sort of race scenario training? So you sort of pre-build a handful of racing scenarios that you've created, and you can run the athletes through mini simulations of those racing scenarios. Maybe just by a show of hands, does anybody actually build that into their training and their practice? Awesome. And how many people, we are a big country. We know that Canada is like 5,000 kilometers from side to side or more. This is a great format. We're on a Zoom call. We're having a great discussion. How many of you guys as coaches get your teams together in video calls and analyze races, where you actually break down a particular race that you could watch and see some of the specific things like Jesse was mentioning, where you're looking for positioning moves or setups or things like that? So just another show of hands. Awesome. Yeah, Petrina, you've had several questions, so I'm going to let you.
Before you do, I missed one mode of training that's actually super potent, and just want to touch on before we move on, because it may or may not be helpful. Equally, if there's coaches with experience with it, love to hear from you. You can do those things where you don't necessarily have to do that with you as a coach to an athlete. One thing that is very, very potent in those like technical and video type skills is actually to set it up so that it's peer-to-peer coaching. So that you have one athlete explain it to the other athlete and walk them through. And what most people tend to do is have the more experienced or senior athlete explain it to a less experienced or less senior athlete. But you can play around with that, and it becomes actually more potent if you have the lesser experienced athlete say, hey, I want you to do a video session with this athlete, and here's how you prepare, here's what you need to look for, how can I help you? Because that actually gets the lesser experienced athlete to think about it more deeply, which actually means that they're learning faster. Because if you do exploration, you inevitably learn faster than when you're told to do something. So that's a nice tool to put into the toolbox if you don't already have that. It's peer-to-peer coaching, in particular around tactics. Sorry, Kev, I jumped in. Back to you.
That's okay. I thought that was a great insertion. Petrina, like we'll sort of keep going because you had a few like fantastic questions.
I'm just going to touch on what Jesse said. My first sport, we did a lot of peer-to-peer coaching, and it's really helpful because just by watching other people, you learn things about yourself and you try things. Yeah, it's super helpful. Something else we did in Alberta this year was athletes had to submit videos of doing skills for selection criteria. And that was really helpful too, because I could see like where we need to spend time working on different things. And yeah, there's lots we can do. But anyway, another question I had was at the end, you mentioned stewardship from the NSOs and PSOs and different organizations, but can you elaborate on what your definition of stewardship is and maybe provide some examples of organizations that have done it really well?
Yes. Let me give that a little bit of thought in terms of who's done it really well and how do you articulate stewardship well. So in essence, if you're a national sporting organization or provincial and territorial state organization, there are things that you can control because you do them and you own them. And there are things that you can influence, which are you don't own them or have complete control over them, but you can incentivize or you can set up rules and regulations that either encourage certain things or limit others. And I think to do that well, it starts with having a really good balance between knowing what the demands of your sport are, and then also having a really good pulse on what the ambitions, interests, and the challenges of those working in the ecosystem are. Because then you can kind of think about rules, regulations, systems, processes, policies, all the important but boring stuff that helps influence the stewardship of an ecosystem. Equally, and maybe most potently, it enables you to connect like-minded groups and like-minded individuals together, either domestically or internationally, that can kind of help supercharge their ambitions, because you create a bit of a critical mass around whether it would be resources or energy and intent. And it'd be different groups within your ecosystem that want different things. Like what a coach that is looking after an 18, 19-year-old athlete that has aspirations has can be very different to what a master's rider might have, or what a school teacher that's looking at, a bit of a standardized school program might be looking for. And so knowing what happens in your ecosystem helps you to connect like-minded people and create more energy, more sharing, more collaboration, and therefore leveraging resources, whether resources be capacity, whether that would be knowledge, whether that would be financial. That's what good stewardship looks like, rather than doing it yourself. Now, who does that well? I think you'll always have people that say that any given entity does it well or poorly at the exact same time, because it kind of depends on what their focus is on and what they're looking at. I can speak from my own personal experience that we and I absolutely try to facilitate these things, but my knowledge and my passion and what I look for is predominantly around high performance and development in towards high performance. That naturally means that I know less about and speak to fewer people around things like masters activity or event hosting and some of the community initiatives. So it's impossible to steward everything, but equally, if you're going to be clear about it, where you can help, where you can't help, that probably is a good catalyzer. It's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but that's probably the best I can do. I know this is also Kevin's field a little bit more than mine if we're looking at community and governance. So Kevin, can I ask you to help out here? Because it's a great question from Petrina, and I'm feeling like I'm not doing it justice.
Well, I think you did. I can't, not sure that I can speak to an organization that I feel has done it extremely well. But I do think that one of the key things in stewardship is that when an organization has when they're able to realize that they don't control everything, and if they can actually continuously work with their stakeholders and just map out the ecosystem. So what are the parts of the ecosystem that exists within that sport, inside the region, the province, the country, and sort of just have a really good understanding of what that is, and then provide, I like the way Jesse said, influence collaboration across those stakeholders in the ecosystem. And if you can actually identify what the main development priorities are for across the various disciplines of cycling, for example, you can actually then encourage certain kinds of collaborative behaviors from people throughout the ecosystem. And I think the more that influence also it needs to capture that concept of stacking a few things together. So it's great to do one thing, that will provide a developmental benefit at whatever sort of stage in an athlete or a systems development that is, but can you do like 2 or 3 things at once? So can you influence or foster different groups of people to come together at things like, let's say, at a race? So if we're having a competition in the sport of cycling, what other things can we wrap around that event so that we actually are creating a little bit more sort of pathway work where you're stacking a few things together? And that can be, encouraging little get-togethers, conferences, seminars, like bolting on, either leading in or coming out of, or like a mini camp. That could be coach development activities or athlete development activities. So the more you can actually use the opportunity when people are together to influence multiple things happening, or like concurrently or in quick sequence, I think that can be super beneficial. And that goes back to some of the things Jesse was talking about in terms of how do we actually learn as people? And that's where, you've got to get people to come together and share their personal perspectives, maybe give them some new information that might be pulled from academic sources or other types of experiences, and then provide the opportunity to redo the peer learning. The more we can do things like that in sort of a cohesive way, in one sort of flowing opportunity, the more we're going to get benefits from that. So that's what I would say is a bit of an example of stewardship and examples of how we can bring it to life. Right. I will move on to, I don't think Josh McKenna was able to join the call, but James, I know you and Josh work together, or I believe you do. James, if you're on the call and you have a question, we'd love to hear from the Executive Director of Cycling Alberta.
Well, thank you, Kevin. So I have been digesting, and I revisited the video, the most recent video. My question is, so we have my colleagues Petrina and Sarah here from Alberta as well, and Tribhune's focus has been on high performance, but she's been influential in helping quite a bit on the development side. But I'm looking a lot right now about collaboration with our at a club structure, because we have gaps in our U15, U13 outside of BMX. And I should clarify, like, I feel BMX in our province is very well developed, has great programming. We saw 4 athletes get world plates in Australia several weeks ago. But where we're challenged is that nurturing for our U15s and your U13s. And when I look at road, there's not a lot of bandwidth for road, and there's not a lot of interest from our race organizers to make inclusion for these categories because it's tough, right? And you only have so much time. So how do we address and I think, Jess, you just mentioned about influencing collaboration. How do we address the road discipline, or do we perhaps not focus so much on road and really focus on mountain bike and track as pathways before they go to road? Because we now have an indoor facility in Edmonton, which my colleague Sarah here has been a bit challenged with because the U15, U13s have kind of been left off the map just because of the cost of running the facility. So we as the PTSO have stepped in to fund that, but that's not a forever solution. And I guess my questions are a bit convoluted here. Like, where should we really focus our energy on, and building racing situations like mountain bike, for example? Is that and I'll finish up. My most recent experience with these age groups was at our Alberta Summer Games. And I really thought, we lost a huge cohort of athletes during COVID, and mountain biking pretty much almost ended. And now we're starting to rebuild this. Is this an area that we should focus more on?
A clarifying question there that may help shape the answer there, James. Can you help me in sharing what the purpose or the mission statement is of your PTSO? Because that might help direct the answer.
That's a good question, and that's something I think we're still defining in our strategic plan. Like, traditionally, the Alberta Bicycle Association, which is now Cycling Alberta, was seen as a governance and rule makers, right? And not really a retail or athlete-centric organization. Like, that's my perspective. Now our focus is on a big part of our new strategic refresh plan is a focus on pathways and creating future gracious champions to a degree, right? Do we see gracious champions as our athletes going to the national team or national projects? But we want to address that gap below that.
Yeah. Okay. That would help. So in lieu of having a really clear North Star and just thinking directionally around, okay, we want to look at, creating gracious champions in the future. Let me start by saying there is pretty much no evidence at all to suggest that in any cycling sport, what you do at 11, 12, 13, 14 years from a performance perspective has any bearing whatsoever around your level of aptitude by the time you hit 20 to 25 years old. So no matter what the cycling sport is, if you're provincial or maybe even national champion at U15, great, awesome, good fun. Does it mean anything in terms of future performance? No. So then what you're left with is the notion of, well, what are the things that do matter? It's like, well, in order to get people to be a gracious champion, you first got to instill a love for the sport. It's got to be fun. It's got to be a conducive environment. It's got to be a healthy club system. And in effect, it doesn't really matter if you're looking at road, maybe BMX a little bit more, but there's a pretty healthy, club membership in BMX race in Alberta, if I recall correctly. And I think you mentioned it. It doesn't really matter where you start. There is a high opportunity to transfer in between cycling disciplines later on, in particular from more complex skill to less complex skill, which is to say it is a lot harder to move from track or road to BMX, but it's absolutely possible and very viable to move from BMX or cyclocross or mountain bike to one of the other two. And given that the market dynamics are pretty clear, it sounds like in Alberta in terms of what the gateway sports is, I'd just say supercharge that, make those clubs really healthy, and then set up structures to enable them to move on if they got a level of aptitude, or if their physiology might be a little bit more conducive in, more of an endurance discipline rather than a power discipline like BMX race. So I would just say leverage the strengths that you have and make sure that you got good thriving environments around the clubs and steward that. And then just, have a look at things where athletes go by the time they turn 16, 17 and try to facilitate that. That'd probably be my answer.
Thank you.
I want to jump in on that one a little bit too, because I think I'd like to sort of add 2 points. So what we talked about in the first conversation with Jesse, and this goes back to some research that he and I had previously done about 6 or 7 years ago. I think it's really important inside PSOs and NSOs to not sort of structurally separate the disciplines as much as possible. So deliberate multidiscipline development of the athletes is when you look at the information, it is profoundly a better way to go about working with your athletes and developing them. One of the things that I think is absolutely happening in the sport, whether it's not just Canada, it's all over the world, is that there's increasing costs and difficulty to put on road cycling events. I don't think that's going to change, but what can be a role that PSOs or NSOs or play in that is actually starting to create more lobbying to the provincial and federal governments to actually secure or build sort of courses where the sport can be conducted. So as opposed to, the way we have historically done the sport is we just allow clubs or independent organizers to create events and races. Look at areas with like close proximity to cities or places where you're going to be able to get to the most of your athletes, and see if you can actually work with provincial governments, municipal governments to secure regular access to certain courses or circuits where you could still sort of safely and appropriately conduct road racing, as opposed to, just having just a mass of organizers trying to do it all on their own. So if the PSOs can play a role in that, that could be a really good route for us to sort of sustain more regular road racing across the country. You see in other countries where, the population is a lot more dense than Canada. They, like Leah experienced it herself as an athlete. She used to go and train at the Tom Dumoulin Bike Park I believe it's in Sittard, but sort of purpose-built outdoor bike parks with sort of asphalt circuits of, 2 to 3 kilometers where you can do midweek or weekend racing are great things, for us to consider in Canada as well. And I think the PSOs and the NSOs are perfectly positioned to actually create that political relationship link to municipal, provincial, and federal governments to get some of those things in place.
As an extension to that, Kevin, definitely seeing all the things that you mentioned. Equally, what I'm seeing in different countries is that there's an emerging trend to more facility-based sports. So if we're talking about road, people tend to think about a road race on like actual public roads. But what you're seeing in a lot of countries that have good development systems is that there's a shift towards a lot more facility-based racing and training. So think about crit courses. A lot of people, when they hear road cycling, some might not necessarily think about crits or them being different, but it doesn't really change that much, but it does lower the complexity a lot from a safety perspective and insurance perspective, road closures, the need for police, all those kind of things. And in addition to that, and I'm sure we've got Nicolas on, I'm sure Nicolas got some experience with it as well. If you have facility-based structures, you can also start leaning into other opportunities that governments provide, in particular around schooling and other development programs. So what they do in the Netherlands and Belgium a lot, for example, they hardly have any road races left. It's all criterium facility-based. And they train on that a lot, whether that would be BMX track, a cyclocross track, a crit track, all facility-based, which is easily controllable, a lot safer, a lot cheaper, lower risk. But then it also enables you to tap into some government funds around, schools and school programs, because they can get in safely, or other kind of social benefits or programs, which actually helps create additional use cases for your facility and drive additional resource streams that you can then deploy elsewhere to set off other pressures. So that's one thing that we're definitely seeing internationally, and it's a hot topic in Australia too.
That's a great segue over to Nick. So Nick, I know you had some pretty interesting questions that you wanted to ask Jesse.
Yeah, hi Jess. The question, I don't remember exactly the question I had, but regarding I had the chance to look this morning the video you did 10 days ago. So I had a couple of questions after seeing that. I was wondering, maybe the first question to start with would be, if you had the chance to return to Canada and the authority to change maybe only one thing in our cycling pathway, what would it be?
Look, I'll state this by saying this is not gospel or what one should do. I'll just affirm my own opinion and beliefs. My personal opinion and belief is, and it kind of got touched on in the first conversation, is like, well, a national sporting federation, and to a degree, I'd also imagine a PTSO, in effect, has two clients. Their membership, whether that's individual members or clubs, depending on how it's set up on one end, and the government on the other hand. Like, those are your two revenue streams, your stakeholders, however you want to call it from a financial perspective, and what keeps the engine running. Now, if we're talking about high performance, the Canadian government, as does the Australian government or the UK government, and a whole host of others, they look at the Olympics and their view is like, well, if we can get athletes on a podium, that's inspirational, that creates a sense of pride, a sense of nationalism. It might get more people into sport. You create role models, and that's worthwhile investing in. And then you got the notion that you got to be a custodian of your sport. So you're holding both things in both hands at the same time, and they're both equally true. So my personal opinion, with that being said, is you got to be really deliberate around, well, where do we actually have the opportunity to contest podiums and create, those inspirational moments? And then look strongly at what is it that we need to do and can do, because that's in effect what that funding stream is for. Now, equally, I mentioned before that it's not an obligation for those organizations to create a pathway, but that doesn't mean that they should not do it, because you absolutely should. My mind is you got to take a polarized approach where you say, we got to look at where is the opportunity to contest podiums and do something genuinely inspirational, and what is that going to take? And then if you can get there, everything else, in my opinion, should go into development. And if you get stuck in the middle, that's a bad place to be, in my personal opinion.
Nice. Thanks. That's interesting. And speaking of leadership, you said that it's not necessarily the job of a national cycling federation to have the leadership towards the pathway. And I think it's interesting because we always often complain on who should do it. So maybe you can have a queue of who should do it, and how could we gather together to make this happen?
Yeah. Let's use an analogy, Nick. Let's say you're on a team at a race. It is the job of the Swanee to have water bottles on the bus, but it's absolutely everybody's responsibility to ensure that there's water on the bus. Same holds true for pathways and development, in my mind.
Interesting. And maybe to finalize with what you just said, did you have some good example of how to avoid, I would say, organization that works in silo, like maybe we're all doing?
Yeah, I mean, it in essence, it's almost the same answer as the first question that we had to Leah, and focus on what you can control and can influence, because everybody on this call can have an influence and impact somebody's journey in a very positive way. And I think that's the most important thing, and that you should focus on. You can always influence it. You can agree with things from a strategic or organizational perspective, or disagree. That can happen. Absolutely. And is it better to collaborate than to be siloed? Yes, of course. But that doesn't make it that you cannot take control and take ownership of what you do have control over, in terms of the development of the athletes that you have and the opportunities that you can provide. Because at the end of the day, an athlete only has an X amount of years to bridge the gap from, a talented junior to, a professional or a national level athlete, if that's the aspiration. So if you say you've got 5 critical years there, well, then you only have maybe 400 sessions And if you waste 10, that's going to have an impact.
All right. Actually, before we, Peter has raised his hand. He has a question. And Osmond, I saw that you raised your hand. I'm not sure if you've got a question. I did want to actually just compliment everyone who joined the call today. Getting back to ecosystems and pathways, like what we're doing today is having a positive effect on the ecosystem. So we're doing our work, and I want to compliment everyone for joining and doing that work. Peter, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, just to be respectful of time, I'll try and keep it direct, but you had a fairly profound statement about, U23 gets really serious and then there's like aerodynamics, and you had sort of a profound amount of numbers and the percentage gains off of 1%. I'm wondering, could you clarify that, like as far as disciplines you're speaking towards, and if there would be something else you would be looking at as far as those differences going to, say, a mountain bike or a BMX?
Yeah. So I'll touch on aerodynamics last. I think key is in terms of that detail and sophistication in U23, which is getting really important. Nutrition is a really big one, and sleep or circadian cycles are another really big one. They influence your recovery, your learning, your potential to, go again. And what you see a lot is if that's not quite right, you get a lot of instances, and even more so with females than with males because of, some biological factors and some unknowns, is RED-S, which is basically it stands for residual energy deficiency syndromes, which are caused by getting the dose response wrong and getting the fueling wrong. And from both a health and performance development perspective, that is really, really, really important. And as you crank up race intensity and training volume at that age, I'd say that's probably the most critical area to have a look at and try to get as right as you can. Now, secondly, if we're talking about aerodynamics and the different sports that you mentioned, the faster you go, the relatively more important aerodynamics become. They don't have a linear relationship. Basically, as soon as you go over 18 kilometers an hour, or at the point of 18 kilometers an hour, roughly, aerodynamics and rolling resistance are equal. Anytime you go faster, it starts to compound. So that means that it gets most important in track sprint and BMX race, even a little bit less on the road. But if you're a sprinter or a time trialer, it becomes incredibly important. If you're a climber, maybe a little bit less, and you want to maximize watt per kilo. So basically, you're looking at two metrics. You got watt per kilo if you got to go uphill, which is the most important part in mountain bike, and if you're a bit more of a climber and you want to maximize that, which is just pure physics. So you got to look at the input and what's the system weight, so the weight of the athlete, the weight of the bike, etc. And the flatter and faster you go, the more important watts per CDA become. And CDA stands for basically your drag coefficient. And that dictates speed. So most of that is athlete position. So having training around like closing your front end, being narrow, having a flat back, being able to produce power in that position becomes really important. And position is more important than anything. If you're looking at it in a time trial or a road position, about 80 to 85% of drag. Now, this is a bit of an estimate because it depends on the size of the athlete, of course, but roughly you could say that's the percentage of drag that the person carries, and 15 to 20% is the bike. So rather than upgrading to a more aero bike, get your position right, learn how to ride that well. That's going to make a much, much bigger difference than upgrading your bike, although at a certain point that does become important, but you get more out of a helmet and a suit from an aero perspective than you get out of a bike still. So those are things just to be mindful of, because optimizing a helmet or getting a really good suit are also a lot less expensive than getting a slightly more aerodynamic bike. If we're looking at sprint and BMX, the second metrics to concern yourself about is not necessarily mass, but what produces power. If you're saying watts per CDA, so we just talked about CDA a bit, the watts input, the closest correlation that you have is lower lean mass. So that is the amount of mass from your hips down. So you want to maximize lower lean mass whilst minimizing the mass of your upper body. You got to be strong enough to manage the weight training if you're in BMX or track sprint. So you definitely should carry some weight around. But the flip side is the more mass you carry into your upper body, the more drag you have. So you want to look at lower lean mass and then functional mass to maintain your training and health for your upper body. That's probably where I'd go. So first and foremost, sleep, fueling, dose, response. Get really good and detailed at that. And then secondly, you could look at the watts per CDA element. And if you're a mountain bike or a road climber, don't worry about it too much. Watts per kilo.
Excellent. So we are close to time for this session. We can keep going for a little bit longer. I do want to get to Osmond and Tiago, who had raised their hand. So Osmond, you had raised your hand. You were curious about something. Love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I don't know if this is more of a question or maybe it's just a comment, but when I put on my high performance hat, I think that one thing that is missing in Canada, maybe globally, is, and I think James was sort of alluding to this, is where are we recruiting the athletes from? I think Jesse would agree that, we're looking at the tip of the iceberg, which is the performance, but that big, huge base, where are those riders coming from? Because when I see clubs in different regions throughout Canada, there's a very, very small pool that they're pulling riders from. So from my standpoint, and I think this is one thing that's always missed in performance, is who's actually working on the recruitment end of things? Who is building that base of that iceberg so that we have a massive amount of people? Because, I can tell you a little bit about my history is that I was in the same boat when I was done with my racing, and I look back and I thought, where are all the riders? Do kids still like to ride mountain bikes? So I put together a mountain bike program, and 10 years later, I can honestly say kids love the mountain bike. We see the growth happening. So, the global relay, you guys are doing amazing things. One area that I would like to pose is, are you investing in the recruitment aspect? Are we growing that big base so that we can push them up to this conversation where everybody's talking about making everybody that much better?
Yeah, it's a great point. There's this notion of talent hotspots, which are typically clubs with a really good coach or a good network around peers and people that really make it a great environment. The more hotspots you can create, the better. But there don't necessarily tend to be that many for any given sport. What you oftentimes hear is the notion that it's a pyramid, and the wider you make the base, the more people make it to the top. If that argument would be true, then India and China and Pakistan would be 1, 2, 3 at the Olympics every single year. They're not. So it's not just around getting more people in a broader base. It's what you actually do with them. And so the more of those hubs or hotspots you can endorse, the higher the likelihood that you get a broader and better talent cohort. What I can tell you as well is if you're looking at that U17, U19 level internationally, in most sports or most cycling sports, Canada is on par with the top nations in the world. They may not have as many, but they're not that many fewer. Where the gap really starts to widen is in that space that we just talked about, is the U23 and early elite space. Would it help to get more of those talent hotspots? Absolutely. And there are a couple of key ingredients, and they're mostly around coaching, volunteers, a really encouraging environment for training and some racing. So the ingredients are known to most, if not everybody on this call, and it's not rocket science. But it's not necessarily about the pool of athletes. I think it's around how many great club environments for that under 13 to under 19 category can you create? And the more hotspots you have, the more of those really good, viable athletes you'd have. I'm not sure.
So Jesse,
yeah.
Yeah, so when you talk about, say, India or China, and you say that they have this massive population, which I would agree, like we have 37 million people in Canada, Norway has 5.5 million. Their performance is much higher than ours, right?
Yes. Well,
so
what I would say to that, because I hear what you're saying. Equally, I want to make sure that it's accurate. I didn't talk about population. I talked about membership base for youth. And Norway is a little bit different in that sense, being that they've got really, really sophisticated school programs that have like almost professional cycling setups in a high school as much as to do with cross-country skiing. So when we're talking about those hotspots, well, that might be 5 or 6 clubs or 7 or 8, pending the discipline in Canada. They've got 8 or 9 schools with professional coaches, et cetera, at the high school age, even though they may not race much, but they're doing incredible development. When you make the analogy to India, Pakistan, China, they've got about 100-fold the membership at that age category, but they don't have those great development hubs. So that's what I meant. I just wanted to get that across accurately before there was a misinterpretation. And sorry to interject.
No, that's okay. So Jesse, I'm actually in Norway right now, and I've been traveling around talking to the general public. I've actually stopped in Lillehammer. I spoke to the soccer coaches there, and as most of you would know, is that they encourage diversity before the age of 13. So there's no specialization in sport. Like Kevin was saying, is that give the athlete an opportunity to try everything, and naturally by the age of 13, they will, if they show an interest, they will then put their hand up and say, I want to get into cycling or cross-country skiing or what it may be. But there are problems here too, from what I've been speaking to, is that like not every region has a high-performance sports school. So they also can do much better. So, like when you talk about these club hotspots, right, that are pushing up to the club level, right, and then pushing to you guys to the high performance, we're working towards creating like a unified Canadian broad base to bring new riders into the sport of cycling and teach them the basic fundamentals so that they develop the confidence to then possibly move into the club system, which will then move up into the performance system. So that's sort of the only sort of comment I have, is that, we always talk about performance, but we don't look at creating that pyramid. The pyramid is still very important. And I think that that's an element that we can all look at, and how can we make that better in Canada? Because think of how many people on the devices right now that could be outside doing performance or just even being active.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one, Oz, because it's something I'm pretty interested in. I believe we have to do both in Canada. So we do have to promote the sport and do more intentional sort of like inviting people to join the sport of cycling and promoting why it's a great sport to participate or potentially compete in. To the best of my knowledge, I do not know that that's happening in a really effective or intentional way for our sport, like across the country. It can be happening in sort of pockets, regionally or provincially, but I do think that there's some work to do there for sure. I do want to say again what Jesse said. When you look at all of the information and you try to quantify Canadian cycling to say, are we at a significant, sort of base of that pyramid disadvantage? The evidence would strongly suggest that no, we are not. So I think we have convinced ourselves that we need, tens of thousands of more people participating in the sport in order to, create the kind of elite athlete success that we aspire to achieve or have as a country. I do not believe that that's the case. I think we have a sufficient number of athletes in the sport. And what the emphasis needs to be for us, all of us together, is to improve the quality game, so we shouldn't be chasing quantity at the expense of really looking inside. How do we work? What are we doing? And is the quality of the programming and the things that we're doing and the services and the support that we're providing to aspiring young athletes at the quality level that it potentially could be for us to do a better job with the athletes we have? And I think if we ask ourselves that question, we would have to come up with an answer that says we can do a lot more work there.
So Kev, just along that line, you say that we have a good pool of potential athletes that are going.
Yeah, they're really dispersed though. So one of the things that's unique about Canada is how it's dispersed. Like we're not, if you compare us, for example, to, actually, this is another little project that Jesse did. We did an analysis where we looked at Canada relative to the Netherlands, and across most of the main metrics, like number of coaches, number of participants, budget of the NSO, and blah, 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 all that stuff was reasonably the same, but what the Netherlands is or has that we don't have is they're very concentrated. It's a small country, so they can get people together more, right?
What was it again, Kev? Was it in the Netherlands for, if you're looking at road, which is 99% crit type racing in the Netherlands, I think it was at the time, now I got to think back hard, I think this was 2016 or 2017. Canada organized for the U17 and U19 levels. There were, I think, a grand total of something like 50, 60 odd race opportunities nationwide in a year.
That we could find or measure. Yeah.
That we could find and measure. In the Netherlands, it was 1,400, which in effect meant that on any day of the week, if you're between the ages of 14 and 19, you could find a race within a 15-minute drive.
Yeah.
That is a big difference from an ecosystem perspective.
Which is something we don't have. So one of the quality things that we need to try to tackle in Canada is the diversity or the dispersion of the people, and how do we tackle that? Like that'd be a really good project for somebody to wrap their head around.
So Kev, that's actually a good point. Is like we're diverse. We're not as concentrated, right? So instead of comparing ourselves to other countries, let's say whatever our number is X, okay? If we made that 3X, that solves one of the problems, because then you're basically filling in that concentration across the country.
Yeah, so that's why I wouldn't say it's one or the other. It has to be both. But I would get back to Jesse's, but also sort of say another and then potentially intelligent or a smart way to go at that increase the numbers is to also sort of map that up also to that idea of talent hotspots, right? So where can we best create talent hotspots in the country? And I actually think we have a person on the call who's sitting in the middle of one that's pretty awesome, and that's Nick, because Nick runs the National Cycling Center in Bromont, and Bromont just has this rich environment where it's got amazing trails for mountain biking. It's got the covered velodrome. It's not too big that it's like too busy there to go outside and ride on the roads, and it's got a vast network of amazing roads. So it has all of the elements that you would say you could potentially need, the physical elements or environmental elements, to create an incredible talent hotspot. Where are some other parts in the country where that can happen, and how do we kind of come together to create a few more of them, so that wherever you are in Canada as a aspiring young athlete, you can more easily get to a talent hotspot. If we can tackle that problem and come up with some really good answers to it, we'd be well on our way to doing some pretty amazing work in the sport of cycling.
I think by clarifying the role also would be, I think on my side, that this is something we need to do really quickly, because we have a lot of good programs in Canada. We have a lot of good people. Sometimes we have to have the eye view of the role, and how can we help each other to be better at what we need to do.
So Tiago, I do want to give you a chance to jump on. I don't know if it's too noisy, but you had raised your hand, and we'll get Tiago on, and then we'll wrap it up quickly after that.
Thank you. There's a lot of wind, but I'm away from the. I think good enough.
Oops.
It wasn't, then it wasn't, Kev, it turns out.
Well, Tiago did type his question in, so maybe I will ask it on his behalf. So preceding these conversations around pathways, so one of the resources that we made available was Chelsea War's work in Australia, Jesse, around sort of creating the new sort of vision and pathway for cycling in Australia. So now that you're actually through the phases of implementing that, his question was, how would you evaluate the parents, the athletes, and the club's response to the sort of pathway rejuvenation work that you guys have done?
Yeah, I'll answer in two parts, because from what I read in the chat, it was particular to U19 selection, but there is the general application and sharing of information versus and the selection itself, which is one part of the broader thing. If you're interested in it, we're currently doing a launch of videos with the elite athletes and some of the coaches to create a better format of sharing the rider principles and information in a format that actually resonates with the athletes and the parents. So a lot of Instagram and TikTok and all of that. There was a very wise individual when I was in a pathway role that once told me, I asked this individual, it was Pete Keen, what is a really good pathway? And his answer was, walk into a local bike shop, wait until you see a kid and a parent, and ask them what the pathway is. If they can articulate it to you, you've got a great one. If they can't, you don't. Which is very confrontational in the sense that we tend to think about it as policies and programs that, long format PDFs that you expect people to read, but they don't. So we're trying to shift and get nuggets of information out in a format that actually resonates with the audience. So I think that's first and foremost. And feel free to jump on the Aus Cycling Instagram and look at a couple and field questions. That has been received quite well, and we still got a lot of work to do in sharing and broadcasting information. I think one of the key shifts in mindset has been that rather than trying to protect information, open source information, don't care if other nations or other teams pick it up, because it's there for people to get better. As it pertains to the U19 selection policy itself, that one's still a little bit divisive, and we got to do ongoing education around it, because we've got the U19 selection policy as part of our, we've got two policies. We've got our Olympic and Paralympic selection criteria, and we've got our non-Olympic. Being that we put a lot of resource into Olympic and Paralympic programs, the U19 selection policy is part of a suite towards, elite world championships in Olympic disciplines and Olympics and Paralympic games. And if you look at the evidence, you effectively got to be either, on or near a podium at U19 world championships, or you're a later development or later developer or later entrant, if you're looking at those that actually go to the Olympic Games and perform, or if you're looking at a World Tour peloton. I think for the women, 60% of the World Tour peloton never went to Junior Worlds. And the other 50-60%, they medaled at Junior Worlds, whether that was road or track or whatever. And there's hardly anything in between. So in our U19 policy for the Olympic and Paralympic, Paralympic doesn't have U19. So in the Olympic disciplines, it actually speaks to criteria that we believe need to be met in order to medal at Junior Worlds. And if you don't meet them, you're not going. And the other resources are therefore going into environments and well, not necessarily clubs, hubs, state institute programs that do the ongoing development. Because at the end of the day, a U19 World Championship selection is just one race. And you need a lot more than one race, and it needs to be developmentally appropriate. So if you're not good enough to medal or showing signs that you might be able to medal, you probably won't get selected, which is very challenging for parents and clubs. But equally, it's around focusing resources and keeping the other pathways viable as well. So that's the honest truth, and that's sometimes challenging, but equally it allows us to more deliberately deploy our resource. And yeah, that's the long and short of it.
All right. So, Jesse, I want to thank you so much for joining us for these 2 sessions that we put together. It's been, I think, a fantastic opportunity for us to pick your brain and learn from you. I want to thank everybody who joined the call today. I know some people had to drop off because we went a little bit over time. Jesse is actually in Canada right now. He's in
Edmonton.
And he will also be in Victoria in the not too distant future. So if people do have questions that we didn't get to, feel free to send them to Leah or myself through the Bridge the Gap email, and we will have an opportunity to get them to Jesse and follow up a little bit with a few additional questions. For anybody that is actually going to be in Victoria in the next handful of weeks, I believe it's on August 21st, Jesse's going to be doing a coach conversation again in person live in Victoria. So if anybody does happen to be around for that, you're welcome to join. Information will be going out soon related to that. And that will be with another organization called 94 Forward, not with Bridge the Gap. So with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for your considerate participation today. It was a stimulating discussion, and thanks, Jesse, for all your insights.
Thanks all. Pleasure.